As Americans, we are taught from an early age to value the study of history as a vital part of our education and our identity as a nation. Study of the American West has been extensive. The number of books published is second only to those written about the Civil War. But within all those volumes, references to African Americans are extremely rare. Today, historians are rediscovering the contributions of African Americans, recognizing their impact as a people, and exploring race relations as they played out in the Wild West. In this 5-part series, Professor Quintard Taylor focuses on African American history in terms of forming communities, combating racism, and changing social and political patterns in the development of the American West. The African American West is presented by the University of Washington's College of Arts and Sciences and the UW Alumni Association. Major funding for this program was provided by Macy's, continuing its long-term commitment to promoting Black history by making this video series available to secondary schools throughout Washington State. Additional funding was provided by the University Bookstore and UW-Medicine. This decade was a period of profound transformation as 500,000 African Americans migrated into the West to join the 1.3 million already there. This lecture will explore the campaign for racial justice and assess its impact on all Westerners. Additional funding for this lecture was provided by Liberty Mutual.
Good evening. I'm Carver Gayton, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's lecture. This is the 4th evening in the series, The African American West, 1528 to 2000. A few acknowledgments I'd like to make at this point. We want to once again thank those of you who are members of the University of Washington Alumni Association, as your membership support makes this series possible. If you're not a member, please consider becoming one to continue the support of the great programs that the Alumni Association has. Throughout time, African American history has been overlooked, but through partnership and collaboration, we are changing that. Quintard Taylor's research here at the university is vital in advancing knowledge about the African American experience. The website that he shared with you a couple weeks ago is very popular. In the week of January 21st through the 28th, there were 8,000 visits to his website. And although 95% of them originated on the computers in the United States, over 30 countries were represented in international visits. As I mentioned, I am the director of the Northwest African American Museum, so sharing history is something that's very important with regard to the museum. We incorporate aspects of African American history and culture in the public school curriculum also. That's something that's extremely important to us. That's a major goal. I think it's interesting to note that Carter Woodson, back in 1926, started the Negro History Week. And then it was 50 years later, started Negro History Month, or African American History Month. It took us 50 years to get to that point. One of the things I think that's extremely important, it's wonderful that we celebrate Black History Month, but it looks like if you look at the calculations, it's going to take about 600 years for us to be able to have African American history incorporated within our curricula on a whole year basis. And that was what Woodson's direction was. He wanted to make sure that we had that incorporated throughout the entire year and where it was appropriate. Establishing the Northwest African American Museum has been a goal of this community for many years. Especially, it's been the goal to have it at the old Coleman School, many of you have seen on 23rd and Jackson. It's had its fits and starts in relation to developing that museum, but the leadership vacuum of establishing the museum was provided by the direction and the vision of the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle, and especially James Kelly, who is the CEO of the Urban League. And so what they decided to do about 6 years ago, they said, we're going to purchase that building, which they have done. They said, we want to have housing, affordable housing on the top 2 floors of that building, and also on the ground floor to have the Northwest African American Museum, which encompasses almost 18,000 square feet. So we are moving in a very positive direction. In fact, we will be breaking ground in May of this year for the renovation of the museum, and all of the construction will be finished in the summer of 2007. So we are making progress, very good progress with regard to something that the entire community has been interested in. But now, moving forward with regard to Quintard, who I've known for many years. He gave me a call when he was at the University of Oregon back almost 16 years ago about something he wanted to find out about Seattle. I hope I was able to help him. I remember in one of his books there was a notation of it, so I guess he did remember what we talked about. This series is about the role of African Americans in the shaping of the American West, but it's also about the leaders of that day. Their actions brought value to our region, not just for the African American community, but for the greater community. These people contributed to the economy of the area, art and music, the life of the region. We all benefit from the richness of our diversity. And I thank you all for celebrating this history with us tonight. Quintard Taylor is also a leader. He is a leader in his fields of teaching research, a leader in presenting multicultural history to people throughout the world, and a leader in our community here at home. Please join me in welcoming back for another evening of this compelling series, Quintard Taylor.
Thank you, Carver. Folks, you are the tough ones. You're here for presentation number 4, and I commend you. Before I get started, I just want to say a couple of things about the way we're going to proceed this evening, but also, given the fact that Carver gave this wonderful introduction, I just want to say again publicly, he has done a remarkable job in terms of bringing this community together behind the African American Museum, and I think he deserves a round of applause. You know, we historians have a symbiotic relationship with museums. I don't think we can exist very long without them, and I know they can't exist very long without us. And of course, we've been working with the museum. We will continue to work with the museum, and I'm waiting for the structure to be ready to the opening night, the opening day, so that all of us can take advantage of this history. What we do here today is just a moment in time. The museum is a permanent structure that's a tribute to African American history, and in this instance, African American history in the Pacific Northwest. And so he's doing, and the staff are doing a remarkable job in making sure that what we talk about tonight is going to be part of the permanent record, the permanent history of this region. Let me begin. World War II was a pivotal moment in the history of the Pacific Coast. First, there was the spectacular population growth of the region as 4 million newcomers arrived as military personnel and defense industries in the states along the Pacific Coast. I dare say that many of you in this room tonight are descendants of people who came to the West during that time period. But the region was also important nationally for the first time in the 1940s because it emerged as a major center for industrial production. Now, to be sure, there were factories here in the Pacific Northwest before 1941, but by 1945, we had clearly established ourselves as a major center for not only the production of war materials, but also materials that will continue to be important in peacetime. Indeed, to put this in perspective, the city that ranked #1 in the country in terms of war production, that is the material for war, between 1942 and 1945, was Detroit. And we can understand that. But the city that was #2 was Los Angeles, and the city that ranked #3 in the country was Seattle. So Los Angeles and Seattle and the West, and particularly the West Coast, literally came of age in terms of industrialization. But I'll argue, and I'll certainly do this for the rest of the evening, that the migration of nearly 400,000 African Americans to California, to Washington, to Oregon in the 1940s also represented a profound change which made these states, for good or ill, increasingly similar to the rest of the United States. Black migrants headed for 6 major West Coast destinations: Los Angeles, Oakland, San Francisco, San Diego, Seattle, and Portland, Vancouver. Of these, Portland, Vancouver grew faster than any other metropolitan area in terms of its African American population. It grew by 1,100%. What you see on the board here, what you see on the screen, is an increase of, where is Portland? An increase of 393%, which is prodigious. But between 1941 and 1945, Portland's black population increased from about 1,900 to 22,000. We'll talk about why Portland lost some of those people a little bit later on in the lecture. But Portland, Vancouver holds the distinction as the metropolitan region with the largest wartime percentage increase in its black population in the entire country. Put another way, Black Portland grew, as I said before, from 1,900 in 1940 to approximately 22,000 in 1945, while Black Vancouver grew from 12 to 3,000 during those same years. Moreover, by 1945, 97% of the African Americans in Oregon lived in Portland. That's sort of scary when you think about it, but 97% of the African Americans in Oregon lived in Portland. But there were other examples of change that came in the Second World War. That war brought a migration which permanently altered race relations as the newcomers, the black newcomers especially, demanded the social freedom and the political rights denied them in their former homes in the South, and sometimes even in the East. Secondly, the migration increased black political influence, as reflected in the election of state legislators and city council members. For example, W. Byron Rumford was elected to the California legislature from Berkeley in 1948. Now, he wasn't a migrant himself, but his political rise, the rise of his ability to run for office and win office, to a large extent had to do with the influx of blacks into Northern California, and particularly into Berkeley. Also, State Representative Charles Stokes, who many of you are somewhat familiar with, I'm sure, was elected in 1950, and when he was elected, he became the first black elected official from Seattle. Not the first black elected official in the state, but the first black elected official from Seattle. Thirdly, the migration strengthened civil rights organizations such as the NAACP and encouraged the enactment of anti-discrimination legislation in Washington, in Oregon, and California. Now, that didn't come easily. Indeed, we could give a whole lecture on the struggles to try to bring about anti-discrimination legislation in each of these states. But the very fact that those struggles began in the 1940s, I think is indicative of the changes going on that were brought by the migration. Portland's NAACP, which, by the way, was one of the first that was established west of the Mississippi River, tripled from about 500 members in 1941 to 1,500 members by the end of the war. But Seattle's NAACP grew even more spectacularly. Seattle's numbers rose from 85 members in 1941 to 1,500 members in 1945. And of course, with the rise of the NAACP in both places, we see what I call an increasing militancy on the part of African Americans, as these black people recognize not only their crucial role in war production, but they also recognize the fact that they had to be engaged in the struggle for full democratization in American society. But I will say something else here. Not only did they realize they had to be engaged in struggle, for the first time, they also realized that they had a powerful ally in the federal government. And we'll talk about that in some detail, but let me give you just one example. In the 1940s, indeed in 1942 as a consequence of Executive Order 8802, the Fair Employment Practices Committee, or the FEPC, was set up. Now, I will say to you that it didn't do all that it promised to do, it didn't do all that it was expected to do, but it certainly did a lot more than had happened before. Indeed, the FEPC was the first federal agency specifically set up to do battle against racial discrimination since the Freedmen's Bureau of the Reconstruction period. In other words, there was a turning of the direction of the nation, and that turning process began, I believe, with the Second World War. But the migration also increased racial tension as the interaction of settlers and natives and of whites and blacks and Latinos and Asians generated violence in Los Angeles and in San Francisco and in Portland and right here in Seattle. This included not just black-white tension, as you see reflected here in terms of, the white native and the black migrant in Oakland in 1942. It also reflects the rise in tensions between and among people of color. And if time permits, I'll try to talk about some of that as it worked its way out in Seattle. But finally, there were tensions that arose within the African-American community. Now, I won't suggest to you that the black community was completely unified before 1941, but certainly with the rise of the migration, there would be tremendous social tensions and social pressures that would emerge within that community, some of which I would suggest are felt right to this very day. Indeed, as the migrants came in from the South, they were going to see themselves in juxtaposition against what were called the old settlers, and the old settlers were essentially anyone who arrived before 1941. And there had to be an adjustment. There had to be a working out process, and we'll try to explore that working out process later in the lecture. A series of events thousands of miles away would eventually spark this profound transformation in the Pacific Northwest. And of course, you see on the map where those events are taking place. The rise of Nazi Germany, the rise of Imperial Japan, and the world being cast into war by 1939. But I would argue that there are events that are taking place within our own country that also help to lead to the change in the Pacific Northwest. And those events can best be described as part of what will be known as the Double V campaign, or the Double Victory campaign. And the man you see pictured here is James G. Thompson, who is, I think, perhaps as responsible as any single individual for raising that issue and mounting that campaign. Thompson was an ordinary black American, and I like to use that phrase because we like to think in terms of superlatives. We like to think of the grand leaders like Du Bois or let's say Adam Clayton Powell and the like in the 1930s and 1940s. But I would suggest to you that there were ordinary African Americans who were going to be as responsible for much of the significant change that would take place. And Thompson was one of them. He was a cafeteria worker in Wichita, Kansas, at the Cessna plant there. He was a person who knew that at that moment he couldn't work as a production worker in the Cessna plant because there were no blacks in production in almost any of these plants across the country. He also knew that the war was coming, and indeed, by 1942, the war was there, and it was already going on in terms of the involvement of the United States. And he wrote a remarkable letter on January 31st, 1942, to the Pittsburgh Courier. And I can't put the entire letter up, but I want you to see some of what he said. Would it be demanding too much to demand full citizenship in exchange for sacrificing my life? Is the kind of America I know worth defending? Some could argue that this almost bordered on treason, but he was talking about something else. He was talking about the fact that in every single war that had occurred in the history of the United States, African Americans had been called upon to sacrifice. African Americans had shed their blood in defense of the country, only to come back to a country that often turned its back on them in terms of political rights. And so his question was profound. And it was answered with his statement at the end. Let we colored Americans adopt the double V. The first V is for victory over our enemies from without, meaning the Nazis, meaning the fascists, meaning the Japanese. But the second V is for victory over our enemies within. And here he was talking about what many people would call the domestic fascists, the racists in America at the time. Thompson's letter was well publicized by the African American press. It became a rallying cry for the Double V campaign that millions of blacks were going to participate in, millions of blacks would embrace throughout the 1940s. But I would suggest to you that Thompson simply gave a name to a campaign which had already begun. By 1940, African Americans realized that the Arsenal for Democracy was quite willing to exclude them as workers, as significant workers. While millions of white Americans were getting jobs in defense plants throughout the country in 1940 and 1941, and right here in Seattle, the number of whites being employed at Boeing was essentially growing in the thousands, almost the tens of thousands by 1942. Yet African Americans were barred from almost every position except those of janitors. In January 1941, A. Philip Randolph toured the country, and he saw firsthand the continued and persistent complaints of defense industry discrimination. He surveyed 120 defense plants, employing collectively over 100,000 people. And what he found out, he wasn't surprised at what he found out, but he was saddened by what he learned. What he found out was that there were only 237 African Americans employed in all of those plants, and every last one of them was a janitor. Randolph's findings were confirmed by the defense employers themselves. The president of North American Aviation in Los Angeles said in early 1941, in response to the inquiries from Randolph and others, and I want to read this. I wish I had an overhead for this, but I want to read this to you. While we are in complete sympathy with the Negro, it is against company policy to employ them as mechanics or aircraft workers. There will be some jobs as janitors for Negroes. But regardless of their training as aircraft workers, in other words, blacks were already beginning to get some training in some schools across the country as aircraft workers. Regardless of their training as aircraft workers, we will not employ them in North American plants. And here he means in the plants of North American Aviation. Folks, I can duplicate this statement for every one of the major aviation companies and almost every one of the major defense contractors in the country in 1940 and 1941. Randolph addressed the Civil Rights Convention in Chicago with his findings. Again, no one's very much surprised at this. Everybody knew what was going on. And it was here that the idea of a March on Washington began. And of course, what you see here is the March on Washington movement, a movement that evolves out of this discussion. And this is, again, a kind of a tribute to ordinary people. At this convention, there was a great deal of discussion about what should be done and how it should be done. And one unidentified female delegate, we don't know, obviously we don't know who she is to this day, said, and I'm quoting here, "We ought to throw 50,000 Negroes around the White House. We ought to bring them in from all over the country in jalopies and trains, any way they can get there, until we get some action," and here she means on the integration of defense plants, from the White House. In other words, direct protest. And again, this is direct protest that's not coming from on high, not coming from the leadership. It's coming essentially from the ground up. It's coming from ordinary people who are getting tired of the racial oppression that's been going on. Randolph pursued her suggestion and called for a march on Washington of 50,000 blacks to protest employment discrimination, and he slated that march to take place on July 1st, 1941. This would have been, to that point, the single largest demonstration in the history of the nation's capital. It would have also been a major embarrassment to the United States. Remember, we were at that time engaged in a huge propaganda war. We had the fighting hadn't started yet between us and the Nazis, but we were engaged in a huge propaganda war. And we were presenting ourselves, as I said before, as the arsenal for democracy, the arsenal of democracy. We were presenting ourselves as a symbol of democratic liberty in a nation, or excuse me, in a world that was increasingly turning toward tyranny. And yet, our liberty was not being extended to a significant segment of the population. I would suggest to you, as Franklin Roosevelt realized at the time, that the Nazis would have had a field day with this. They would have been able to talk about American hypocrisy, much to the embarrassment of the United States and its allies. In an unprecedented move, Franklin Roosevelt sat down with Randolph in the White House on June 25th, 1941. Following that meeting, and it's a very interesting meeting, but we don't have time. I don't have time to go into it. But following that meeting, he issued Executive Order 8802, which prohibited discrimination in the defense industries. Again, this is a first. This is the first time the federal government has, since 1875, taken action, taken affirmative action, if I can use that phrase, to try to deal with racial discrimination. Later on, Roosevelt would create, as I mentioned before, the Fair Employment Practices Committee to monitor that discrimination. Again, the first time an agency like this was established since right after the Civil War. Executive Order 8802, combined with the labor shortage that surely would come once we entered the war, led to tremendous black employment gains during the Second World War. As a matter of fact, historians debate whether or not most of the gains came from the executive order or whether they came from the shortage of labor. I don't know the answer to this. What I know is perhaps it's the combination of the two that would spark unprecedented opportunity for African Americans, as you're going to see in a minute. Nearly 4 million black people before the end of the war would be employed in defense industries in a variety of capacities. In other words, they would work for the very men who in 1941 were saying, we will never hire them. In fact, World War II, supported by Executive Order 8802, generated what I call a new Great Migration, as 1.2 million African Americans took to the road to find new employment opportunities all over the country. Now, we know part of this story. Many of them headed for war production centers in Chicago and Detroit and Mobile, Alabama, and Norfolk, Virginia. However, but the most dramatic growth was going to be on the West Coast. About 31% of the African Americans who moved in the years of the Second World War came to Washington, to Oregon, and to California. 31%, 1/3 of the population that moved came here, came to the West. Between 1941 and 1950, the black population of Washington, Oregon, and California grew from 124,000 to 494,000. But to put this in perspective, guys, and many of you are probably not familiar with the first Great Migration during the World War I years. That's the time when blacks left the South in huge numbers, almost 500,000. Well, let me suggest to you that the second migration to the West Coast alone is almost as large as the first migration, the first Great Migration that historians often talk about. In other words, something powerful, something dynamic was taking place. And for the first time, it was involving this region of the country, particularly in terms of African Americans. Getting here proved the first challenge. Many migrants followed hot, dusty stretches of US Highway 80 and Route 66, made famous 10 years earlier by the Dust Bowl migration. They came across Texas and New Mexico and Arizona, and then up California's Central Valley on their way to Portland and on their way to Seattle. They came with, and I'm going to use the words of one historian, their mementos, history, and hope, all tied to the top of a car. Since few hotels along the route accommodated black people, migrants took turns driving, and they camped by the roadside. On occasion, they stayed in African-American homes along the route in Amarillo, in Albuquerque, in Flagstaff, in Los Angeles, and even in San Francisco. Train travelers faced 4 days on crowded, uncomfortable cars. And here's the situation with the trains. If one was coming from the South, if one was coming from Texas, one rode a segregated car to the border. And the border, in this instance, would be El Paso. Once you reached El Paso, you could then move around in your cars. But up until the moment you reached El Paso, those coming from Louisiana, those coming from farther east, all of those people had to ride segregated cars. There's one example of Bertha Walker, again, one of those ordinary black people, who in 1943 rode out of Texas on a Jim Crow car, as she remembered. And she recalled changing trains in El Paso. And at that moment, a white soldier gave up his seat to her, saying, "You can relax now. We're at the MasonDixon Line. You can relax now. We're at the MasonDixon Line." I hadn't realized until I read that the Mason-Dixon line stretched all the way down to El Paso and the Mexican border. But understand, we're talking about the definition of the South, and that definition is writ large by the racial policies that existed in Texas at that time. Black people were coming, and as they came, there was growing anxiety, and you're gonna see examples of that anxiety all over the place. Indeed, this huge influx was of growing concern to those who were already here, both whites and blacks. And indeed, there was a little quote that came out of the period, and I don't know where it originated from, but it sort of symbolized this sense of anxiety, this growing concern about this huge migration that was taking place. The quote goes like this: "The state of Arkansas has moved to California. The state of Texas has moved to California. And California has gone to hell." And you can see from these figures, you can see what was going on. I need not explain to you these huge population increases, these surges in population. I mean, these were places, this is unlike the first Great Migration up to the north in 1916, 1917, 1918, where African Americans were actually coming into pre-existing communities. In many, many instances in the West, they came to communities that didn't have any black folks at all. Vallejo, California. And even look at the figures for Bremerton or Pasco or Vancouver. Vancouver, Washington, 12 in 1940 and actually 4,000 by 1945. These are huge influxes. In this particular instance, there's no conflict between the old settlers and the newcomers. The newcomers are the only people there. You know, they are the ones who are going to set the standard. But in other places like San Francisco and Seattle, there will be a conflict. I'm going to actually veer from the text and just show you some images. We often, when we talk about the Great Migration, and I've certainly done it over the years, the Great Migration of World War II, we focus on Los Angeles or we show slides of San Francisco and Oakland, but I think there are more interesting places that are much closer to home. How about Sinclair Park in Bremerton, Washington? How about another shot from Bremerton, Washington? Sinclair Park. I don't know how many of you have even heard of Sinclair Park, but Sinclair Park was a housing project that was built expressly for African Americans who came to Bremerton in the World War II period. And it became a vibrant community and continued to be a vibrant community until it was dismantled in 1948. But as you saw in the previous slide, it was the first home in the West for a very young Quincy Jones. And it was also the first home for a number of other African Americans, some of whom eventually ended up in Seattle, and some of whom will probably have descendants in this room tonight. Let me give you one other. And I don't know if this fits at all with my lecture, but I thought it was a great photo. These are Seattle pinup girls. I found this, let me make an aside here, guys. I found this in the National Archives. I was browsing the website of the National Archives looking for representative photos of the Pacific Northwest, and this is the only one they had. and so I was forced to use it. Let me give you a bit of information. Let me give you a footnote. The woman on the far left, and some of you may actually identify her, you may actually know her. The woman on the far left is Jean McIver Harris. She is the aunt of Councilman McIver. And I had to confirm this with him just to make sure that I had the information straight. But she is one of the people who were part of this community. Now, and what you have here is a very interesting situation. These were both newcomers and old-timers. In other words, this is one of those rare photographs where the newcomers were actually integrated with the old-timers. That often did not happen, but nonetheless, it's symbolic of the kind of process that was taking place in the Pacific Northwest at the time. I'm gonna focus our attention for a few minutes on not Seattle, but our sister city to the south, Portland. In some ways, Portland, Oregon represents even a more dramatic change in terms of its social structure, in terms of its politics, in terms of its very existence as a result of the influx of African Americans, in part because Portland, Oregon would actually get a lot more black people than Seattle. Portland would have, as I think I said before, 22,000 African Americans by 1945, as opposed to only 10,000 in Seattle. And of course, the reason for that, let me be very clear, the reason for that is Kaiser. The reason for that are the Kaiser shipyards. Portland, Oregon offers stark testimony on the rise of the black Pacific Northwest. As I said before, the impact of the migration is going to loom large, not just on the migrants themselves and not just on the blacks in Portland who were there before, but on the entire city. Before World War II, virtually every black person who worked in Portland was either a maid or a janitor. Let me repeat that. Before World War II, virtually every black person who worked in Portland was a maid or a janitor. By 1945, 95% of the black workers in Portland were engaged in shipyard work for the 3 Kaiser Yards. In other words, the script had been completely flipped. All of these black folks who had been working in kitchens before were now working in the shipyards, and they were making more money, as you can imagine, than they had ever dreamed. Let me give you some background on this. In 1941, even before the United States got into the war, California industrialist Henry J. Kaiser decided that in order to get prepared for the coming conflict, he had better, and meaning his company, had better expand shipyard building facilities, not just in the San Francisco, Oakland Bay area, but also to have a second major area for production in the Pacific Northwest. They chose Portland, and it was an important move. Certainly it was an important move for Portland's economy. The shipyards in Portland were going to be enormous. There will be 2 shipyards, and well, you can see a couple of these. There's the shipyard, the Kaiser Yard in Vancouver on the right. There's the Kaiser Yard in St. John's or Portland on the left. I think I've got a map here. Yeah, this is perfect. You can see where the 3 major shipyards were located. Vancouver, Oregon Shipbuilding, and then Swan Island. You can see Swan Island. Those were the 3 major shipyards, all organized by that man, by Henry Kaiser. Henry Kaiser could arguably be said to have been the most powerful man in the Pacific Northwest, and maybe one of the most powerful men in Washington. As you're going to see in a minute, when he had conflicts with the state of Oregon, with the city of Portland, he went around both to the President of the United States. And usually Henry Kaiser got what he wanted from the President of the United States. Here he's with Eleanor Roosevelt, but a lot of people take pictures with Eleanor Roosevelt. But Kaiser has real power, as you're going to see in a minute. As I said before, these shipyards were nothing short of enormous. By 1943, nearly 100,000 people worked in the 3 Portland shipyards. In fact, more people worked in the Portland shipyards than worked in the Kaiser Yards in California. Or to put it in perspective, 100,000 people working for these 3 shipyards in the Portland area, because many of them worked on the Vancouver side. 100,000 people working in the Portland yards is a far cry from the 18,000 people who work in the largest factory in Oregon today. In other words, there were far more people working for Kaiser in World War II than there are people working for any single factory, any single production service in Oregon right to this day. The Kaiser people would bring in a lot of folks. They would recruit all over, and included in that recruitment would be 8,000 African Americans. And by the end of the war, they would comprise almost 9% of the overall shipyard workforce. However, they were 96% of all the black workers in the city. Let me show you a Kaiser ad. Kaiser, as one memo stated, and I won't get into it here, but Kaiser scoured the city. As the memo stated, they were intent on hiring every single woman who wanted to work in the city of Portland and beyond. And of course, you'll find out in a minute, eventually there weren't enough women to fill those positions. Bernice Thompson, a Portland African-American, recalled the Kaiser recruiter who canvassed her neighborhood, her albino neighborhood that is in Northeast Portland. And the recruiter announced to all who would listen, quote, "I don't care if you have an education or not. We will find the job for you at the shipyards if you're willing to work." By 1942, Kaiser had hired so many women and so many non-traditional workers, meaning blacks and Latinos and Native Americans and even some Asians who were around, that the Boilermakers Union for the Kaiser Yards said, "These new Kaiser workers represent a bottom-of-the-barrel assortment of shoe clerks, soda jerks, professors, pimps, and old maids." I don't know what's worse. I mean, the professors or the pimps. but these literally are the people who are coming into the yards. And in case you think this is an exaggeration, I was actually, 20 years ago, I was fortunate to interview some of the people who worked in the yards. And a couple of people that I interviewed were actually people who had left their jobs at Washington State University to go to work in the shipyards. Indeed, the shipyards paid more money than Washington State University, and I dare say they probably paid more money than the University of Washington or other places as well. Yet, even with all of these people who were swept up into the Kaiser Yards, there was still a huge regional labor shortage, as became evident by late 1942. At that point, Kaiser went to the federal government, he went to the Roosevelt administration, and he received permission from the federal government to recruit workers from the East. Now, this is no easy feat because the East Coast has its own labor shortages, and Kaiser is in effect talking about moving labor from one area where there's a shortage to another area. But he was able to persuade the Roosevelt administration to allow this, and thus, between 1942 and the middle of 1943, Kaiser would recruit, and I mean the company now, Kaiser would recruit 38,000 workers on so-called Liberty trains that would specially originate, or that originated in New York City, especially for these people to come out to Portland. In other words, Kaiser is saying, we are going to move people from the east to the west to where the jobs are. But for our discussion, for the purposes of our discussion, the people are going to come not from New York City, they're going to come from the south. And they're going to come because Kaiser pays some of the best wages in the country. Indeed, there's another flyer that Kaiser put out in 1943 that reflects on almost a patriotic duty of people to come and work in the shipyards in Portland. Let me read to you part of what that flyer said. There's a job of vital importance to your company waiting for you in the Portland shipyards. You can learn a trade, get paid while you're learning, and earn the highest wages for comparable work anywhere in the world. That's not far from the truth. There were some exceptions here, but indeed, this was the call. This was the call that went out not just to New York, it also went out to Louisiana, it also went out to Texas, it also went out to Tennessee, it also went out to Oklahoma, and a huge number of, far more whites responded to this, obviously, but a huge number of African Americans would make their way. Wartime migration soon assumed a momentum independent of Kaiser's recruiting. In other words, Kaiser didn't have to recruit anymore. Black workers wrote home describing the conditions, particularly the high wages, the fact that it seemed that racial conditions were better in Portland. And they also talked about the, quote, mild climate in Portland in the winter. And as a result, by 1943, by the end of 1943, nearly 75% of the black migrants to Oregon came independently of Kaiser Recruitment. In other words, this migration was taking place on its own, that people were deciding to come to the Pacific Northwest and specifically to the Kaiser Yards in Oregon because of the job opportunities. We've already talked about the states, or I've suggested the states that would send the largest number of workers: Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma. They would contribute, not surprisingly, a disproportionate number of African American newcomers. I should say, though, and this is something that's not generally known, 53% of the people who would go to work in the Kaiser plant, the Kaiser shipyards, were women. 53% of the black people who would go to work in these shipyards were women. Many of them were married, many of them were not. But the very fact that these were black women working in the yard sort of undermines the image of the single male shipyard worker. And that was the image that we had through most of our history, that this is a man's job. Well, all of a sudden, women were now filling these jobs. As a matter of fact, the Oregon Shipbuilding Company, one of the Kaiser facilities in Portland, became in 1941 the first yard in the nation to hire women in non-clerical posts. By 1943, women comprised 40% of all the shipyard workers in Portland, Vancouver. Let me repeat that. By 1943, women were 40% of all the shipyard workers in Portland, Vancouver. But black women were a majority of the African Americans in the yards. Wartime labor demands guaranteed black women and men that they would work, but they did not necessarily guarantee equal treatment. Throughout the war, black workers, shipyard managers, and union officials engaged in what I call the three-way struggle over so-called workplace segregation and worker assignments. In a bewildering order of job allocation by the shipyard unions and the managers, black workers could build ships, but they couldn't repair them. Black workers could clean ships, but they couldn't paint them. Black workers could weld steel plates, but they couldn't weld steel pipes. Now, for someone outside, I don't know the difference here, but apparently this was very important to the Kaiser people, and as a result, a system of discrimination began to emerge in the yards, even though people were receiving very, very good pay. Doris Mae Williams, originally a Kaiser shipyard welder, that is, she was hired as a welder, took a job as a laborer rather than suffer from continued abuse from her supervisor, who said over and over again that she wasn't qualified to be a welder. Eventually, and not just the supervisor, but also the co-workers as